So I'm Corley Phillips. I'm the chairman of Sierra Forward, and we thank you for joining what is now our third town hall meeting and what's going to be an ongoing series of very interesting discussions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Les to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Corley. And thanks everybody for joining us. Just a word about Sierra Forward. We are now 6 years old and are operating in the 20 counties of northern and northeastern California, the mountain and foothill counties and adjacent valleys, basically the territory of the 1st, 3rd, and 5th congressional districts, just for geographic reference. It's one of our aims is to have discussions on important issues with interesting people. And Stuart certainly qualifies. Stuart and I have gotten to know each other over the last few months, and he'll talk about how that has happened and what we're doing. But he is a guy that I have known about for a long time as one of the most successful and sought after, no longer Republican strategists and media consultants. And he'll tell you about that story. But he's seen it happen and he's seen it firsthand. He's worked with all the top Republican candidates, and he'll talk about one of them in particular, Mitt Romney, whose presidential campaign Stuart was the chief strategist on. But anyhow, Stuart is a terrific guy, smart, brilliant strategist, great writer, and he's going to talk for a little while and then take questions. And Stuart, I really do want to thank you for taking time to do this. Personally, it's very
man.
So,
love to. So thanks. I've gotten to know Les through this group that really organized around Dick Gephardt in our efforts to try to bring some sanity to the no labels attempted effort to run a third-party candidate in the 24 election, which would 100% do nothing but help elect Donald Trump, perhaps ensure that Donald Trump will be elected. And it's a group of these Democratic consultants. I told Les I feel like I've been given a backstage pass to this Democratic super group, that all these people that I always heard about and worked against. And it's been great to get to know them. It's a lot more fun to work with them than against them. I was a Republican media consultant for a long time. I grew up in Mississippi. I was a 7th generation Mississippian. And when I came up in politics, there were only Democrats in Mississippi. My family was close because they had gone to Ole Miss with a guy named William Winter, who, then in Mississippi, everybody was pretty much defined by your position on race, all the white politicians. And there was a phrase that people used at the time, "Are you good on race?" And Winter was moderate on race. He ran in 1967 in the Democratic primary, which, because there was no real Republican, decided to race against the last avowed segregationist who got elected in Mississippi, a guy named John Bell Williams, who was a World War II veteran who had lost an arm, who was a sort of fire-breathing segregationist. And that was my first involvement in politics at all. I was just a kid, and I did the stuff you do when you're a kid. I walked precincts, and my dad was a lawyer, but he had been an FBI agent. And, at that time in Mississippi, there was a lot of doubt about law enforcement agencies and how close they were to the Klan, whether or not they could be trusted. We now know that when the 3 civil rights workers were tragically murdered in Mississippi, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, they were stopped by a deputy sheriff and turned over to the Klan. So when William Winter was running in 67, there were a lot of death threats against him. these have actually, a lot of them have been saved because Bobby Kennedy wiretapped everybody. And there is a wonderful documentary that has been made about William Winter called The Toughest Job, which is ostensibly about his efforts to pass education reform. He lost that 1967 race, but I worked in all his losing races. And finally, when I quit working for him, he was able to get elected. And he got elected in 1981. And but this documentary, which I encourage you to look for, called The Toughest Job, is really a story of William Winter. And in that 67 race, I have this very vivid memory of being in a high school locker room down in South Mississippi, where Winter was supposed to go out and give a speech. And that was a time when you could still draw a big crowd or something like that in the high school stadium. And there had been this very specific death threat that if he went out, he would be shot at the stadium. It was at night. And, you know, I was just a kid sitting there not saying anything, but there was a group of men, one of whom was my father, who were sort of ad hoc security for Winter. Some were retired law enforcement, some were off-duty law enforcement. And they were trying to convince William Winter not to go out and give this speech. And Mrs. Winter was there and sort of obviously very upset. And Winter was a very tough guy. And he refused not to cancel the speech. So they went out to cars and brought back one of these big, bulky, bulletproof vests that he put under his jacket. And then my dad and these other guys went out to the car and they came back with rifles that they put under their coats. And Winter walked out of this locker room into this stadium. And I thought it was just the bravest thing I'd ever seen in my life. And if that was politics, I wanted to be part of it. It later came out there was someone there who was planning to assassinate Winter, and maybe would have had he not had some security. But I, growing up, had really been interested in three things: politics, film, and writing. And have tried in my life to pursue all three at different times, in different ways. I was a page in Washington for the first Republican congressman to get elected since Reconstruction in Mississippi, a guy named Thad Cochran. And Thad Cochran was this classic young Rotary Club attorney in Jackson, Mississippi. You know this type. He's a guy in his 30s. Everybody liked him. Then the Democratic Party of Mississippi was run by Jim Eastland and John Stennis, two segregationists, though Stennis was less crude of a segregationist than Eastland, but still came from that. And there really weren't any Republicans. And Cochran ran, got elected as a Republican. I was a page in his office. And later I was in film school out in UCLA, and the guy who had been his, what we then called administrative assistants, and they now more pretentiously call chief of staff, was running for his congressional seat. And that guy I knew because he had been my boss when I was a page. And he was running against John Stennis's son, the senior senator's son. And nobody thought he had any chance. He didn't have any money. And he called me and said, look, I can't afford to hire anybody. I need somebody to make commercials. Can you make, you have to make commercials for me. I said, well, that's great, John. Except I don't know how to make television commercials. I just make these stupid little films in film school. He said, it doesn't matter, you have to do it. So I ended up making commercials for him, and he ended up winning, not with anything due to anything I did. He was just in the right place at the right time. And he got elected to Congress. And that was the year that Thad Cochran became the first Republican to get elected to the Senate since Reconstruction. And then I discovered that people would pay me money to make political commercials for them. And nobody wanted to hire me to write then. And I could do it kind of like migrant labor work. I could work in campaigns for a few months, and then I could try to write. And then eventually I got where I could get published, and I wrote magazine articles, I wrote books, I started writing for television. But I had I had gotten into being a political gunslinger. And, once you start out working for one side, you really can't work for both sides, or no one ends up trusting you. So I work for Republicans, and I probably represent the worst of the American political system in that I just was a campaign guy. And I liked campaigns because you won or lost. I had a pretty simple value system. If I won, I was happy. If I lost, I was unhappy. And I really didn't think about it much more than that. I never was interested in what we call in politics going inside, working for someone who you helped elect once they were elected. I just like to do campaigns. And the secret to success of in political consulting is to work for people who are going to win anyway and just don't screw it up. And I had good clients. I was lucky. And I worked for a lot of winning campaigns. And as you start to do that, you start working in bigger campaigns. And I worked in the Bush campaign in 2000. I moved down to Austin in the spring of 1999 and worked for Bush through our landslide. I wrote a book about the Bush campaign called The Big Enchilada. I worked in a lot of foreign races. I worked in Israel, all over. I worked in Havel's first race when he ran in Czechoslovakia. A lot in Africa, Venezuela. And I liked the whole concept of the challenge of, I guess you would say, manipulating people. And I worked for Dole in '96, and then I did Bush, and I did Bush's reelect, and then I got involved with Romney sort of late in his 2008 effort. And then I really didn't think Romney was going to run again after 2008. He wasn't really planning to run again. His father had run briefly for president and dropped out after he famously was quoted as saying that he was brainwashed by military and supporting the war in Vietnam. And I think Mitt had probably his father was an extraordinary man, apparently, by all accounts. And, he wanted to run for president. His father had. And then he lost. And then he found out he could be perfectly happy having lost. And Mitt Romney is someone who is very self-aware and realizes he's one of life's lucky people on so many levels. He had wonderful parents, wonderful family, obviously born into privilege. So his dad never graduated from college and never had any money. He was first generation to make any money when he was head of General Motors. And Mitt was writing a book. He and his wife, they had 5 sons, raised them in Boston. Then when the sons, grew up, went to college, got married, they did a typical thing. They sold the house where, they'd raised the kids. And I'd always wanted to live like in California on the ocean. They got a place in La Jolla, and he was writing this book. I used to go down and see him. I kind of half live in Santa Monica and half in Vermont. And I would drive down and see him, and he was happy as could be. He was sitting there, his kitchen table writing his book. And then I think had the economy gotten better, faster, I don't think he ever would have run for president in 2012. But the economy was, you go back, unemployment was still over 8% right up until the last quarter before the election in 2012. So he decided to run. And in retrospect, knowing what we know about the Republican Party now, it's pretty extraordinary, I think, that Romney won the primary. And we could see then this craziness in the party. And, Mitt and I used to talk about it. I say, Mitt, if the party goes crazy, there's just nothing we can do. You can't chase that. I mean, the only thing you can do when the world goes crazy sometimes is just not go crazy. And, he ran basically on an economic platform that he made the decision, if you were going to beat me in the primary, you had to beat me on the economy. And nobody did. And, you go back, you remember Rick Perry was governor of Texas, who in many ways was sort of in a DeSantis position as now. And he was considered a favorite. and eventually Mitt won the nomination and ran and lost. It was a very interesting race in many ways, in retrospect. And on election day, both Romney and Obama had favorables of 50%. I don't think we'll see that again. Well, certainly not, in the near future. It was, if you remember, well, I say remember, if you are unfortunate enough to really have a life involved in politics, this will mean something to you. If you're a normal person, it probably won't. But, after Watergate, we passed federal funding of presidential campaigns. And both candidates, if they voluntarily entered this system, when you won the nomination, you got the same amount of money, Democrat and Republican, if you agreed not to raise any more money or spend any more money. And 1976 was the first year that was in effect, and everybody stayed in the system until 2008, when Barack Obama campaign realized that they could raise just unprecedented amounts of money on the internet, and Obama got out of the system. So when you had that system, it leveled the playing field, both candidates had the same amount of money. So Carter lost and Bush lost. Then McCain stayed in the system. McCain got like 82 million. Obama ended up spending in the general election about 350 million. He spent over 700 million primary and general. And then you get to 2012, and the history of public financing is, as soon as someone gets out of the system, it blows up the system. Once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back. So 2012 was the first time since 1972 that the incumbent president and the challenger were both outside of the federal funding system. And they both raised and spent over $1 billion. So the second time was Biden-Trump. Trump, the incumbent president, obviously. So Biden beat Trump, obviously. And I think it's an interesting question, a fair question to ask. When is the last time an incumbent president lost who was not in the federal funding system? And the answer is Herbert Hoover. And Hoover had a bad year. So, I read a lot of people kind of down on the Biden campaign or something. For me, I think they ran an extraordinary campaign, because I have such respect for what it takes to beat an incumbent president, particularly when that incumbent president can basically raise unlimited money, which a president can do. I think they ran an incredibly disciplined campaign. They reinvented the convention on the spur of the moment. And man, I've done a lot of these conventions. I've sat in these rooms trying to plan these things, and to have 3 or 4 good nights in a row is incredibly hard, and they did, even though they invented this new form, really. And I think that they continue to be a very underestimated political operation. In 2016, when Trump emerged, there were a lot of people who were wrong about Trump, but it really is difficult to find anybody who was more wrong than me. I didn't think he'd win the primary or the general. And when he did, I had a lot of my Republican friends that, tried to say, well, Stuart, he hijacked the party. That was the thing we said then. But I was like, I don't see how you can say that with any kind of intellectual honesty. He's the most popular person in the party. How do you say that person? When you hijack, like the guy who hijacks a plane is not popular on the plane. They're not saying we really like this guy. And that's what was happening in the party. So, in that kind of high school English teacher way of, if you can't write something, you don't understand it. I started asking myself a lot of questions about, well, how is it that I missed this? I mean, I was there, I was part of this. I didn't see this. And I started reading a lot about the history of the party, and eventually that grew into this book I wrote, which was published in 2020, because it was all a lie, how the Republican Party became Donald Trump. And the conclusion I came to was that really in post-World War II Republican Party, there have been these 2 strands of the party. One had, call it an Eisenhower strand, governing, boring, sane, and then a Joe McCarthy strand, conspiratorial, xenophobic, often racist, non-governing. And, you know, there is a group of us who worked for Bush in 99 and 2000, 2004. And we used to literally all sit in the same room, like me, Nicole Wallace, Matthew Dowd, Mark McKinnon, who has, you know, Michael Gerson, who was Bush's speechwriter, who tragically died last year, who had a column for years and years in the Washington Post, extraordinarily beautiful writer. Pete Wayner, who writes for the Atlantic now. And we all assumed, I think it's safe to say, that we were the dominant gene in the party, that this concept of, call it compassionate conservatism. And if you remember, you know, when Bush went out and called himself a compassionate conservative, a lot of conservatives said, well, wait a second, are you trying to say that conservatism as it is now is not compassionate? And Bush's answer was pretty much, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And, you know, you can make an interesting argument, I think there's a lot of truth to this, that the Republican Party entered a crisis due to the success of its policies or its principles or what it mainly stood for. The Cold War was over, Berlin Wall had come down, crime had gone down in the 90s tremendously, the deficit had gone down. Now, a lot of these things happened while Clinton, the deficit and crime came while Clinton was president. And that the party was sort of, you know, crime, taxes had gone down. So that kind of strong on the Soviet Union, crime, welfare, taxes, those problems are kind of over. So there was this fundamental question that Bush was wrestling with in 2000. What does it mean to be a Republican? And his effort to address that really was the essence of compassionate conservatism. And if you remember, the issue that impassioned him the most was education. Excuse me. And first piece of legislation, really, I guess the only major piece of legislation he passed before 9/11 was No Child Left Behind. And you can argue and will argue, should argue about the merits of that legislation. But, you know, remember, it was very much a bipartisan piece of legislation. There's that famous photograph of him signing this No Child Left Behind with Ted Kennedy over his right shoulder. And today in the Republican Party, that would be submitted like at a war crimes tribunal, like at The Hague or something, you know. And then he became a wartime president on 9/11. And there's sort of a part of the game that some of us play, sort of depressing, of what Bush would have been like, what would have happened if he'd not been a wartime president. And I think the best indicator is how he governed in Texas, where, you know, he was very much a bipartisan governor. The Texas legislature was still half controlled by Democrats then, so he sort of had to be. But that didn't happen. And then you had Obama, McCain picked Palin, and just sort of a statistic that I really think blows my mind here. 1980, Ronald Reagan wins his sweeping landslide. What, 44 states left? I can't remember, something like that. With 55% of the white vote. 2008, John McCain, he loses a not particularly close race with 58% of the white vote. And that, in essence, I think, tells the story of how we got to where we are now. Because in my view, what has happened now in the Republican Party, you can make a very good case, is all about race. In 1956, Eisenhower got 39% of the black vote. Nixon got 33%. Jackie Robinson campaigned for Nixon. And then it fell to 7% in 1964 with Goldwater when he opposed the Civil Rights Act. Now, you could have made a case that after the Civil Rights Act passed, that a certain number of African Americans would drift back to the party because of shared values of patriotism or entrepreneurship, cultural conservatism, faith, but that didn't happen. Trump got 8% of the black vote. So you go up 1 point every 56 years. That's going to take a while. And I think that the tragedy of the party is that it had a choice. It either had to do what it was took to attract more non-white voters, or go down the path it did go down. It has gone down, which is to become a white grievance party and to try to do everything it can to make it harder for non-whites to vote and others at the lower economic end of the scale. In Bush world, we failed at this. We did not succeed in getting more African-American votes. Bush got 41% of Hispanic votes, which is a high watermark. But at least we recognized that was a failure. Does that matter? I think it does. Ken Mehlman who was chairman of the RNC, had been Bush's campaign manager in 2004. He went before the NAACP in 2005 and apologized for the Southern strategy. I think that's a very different party. And what really, I talked to Nicole, those of us, it wasn't like, we played too much to the dark side, but campaigns tend to do that. But we at least aspired to be something better. And that's just lost now. So, if you remember, after Romney lost, the party went through this so-called autopsy, where Reince Priebus, chairman of the party, commissioned a study came inevitably known as an autopsy of, why is it Republicans have lost every popular vote in presidential elections except for 2004, since 1988, right? Bush won popular vote in 1988, Bush won in 2004. And we barely won in 2004. Had 60,000, 65,000 votes in Ohio changed, we would have lost. So the conclusions of that autopsy were pretty obvious, but they were correct. And it was what? You had to appeal to more non-white voters. You had to appeal to more women, particularly women who worked outside of the home. You had to appeal more to younger voters. And it was presented not just as a political necessity, but as a moral mandate. That if you were going to earn the right to govern this big, confusing, cacophonous, changing country, you had to be more like that country. So then Trump comes along. And there's almost like this audible sigh of relief, like, thank God we don't have to pretend that we care about this shit anymore. We can just win with white voters. And for me, the moment that goes down, it's sort of like the Pearl Harbor moment. December 5th, weirdly, 2015, when Trump came out for a Muslim ban. And that was the turning point. Because if the Republican Party could say it stood for anything, it was the Constitution. And a Muslim ban is a religious test. What else could it be? I mean, I used to say, like, remember the old folk singer Cat Stevens, who became a Muslim. Like, what do you do if Cat Stevens shows up at Heathrow and says, well, I'm actually a Quaker now? What are you going to do? You're going to ask him like questions about William Penn? It's a religious test. And what Reince Priebus should have done, he should have said, we're not going to support this. Now, I'm chairman of this party. I can't stop anybody from voting for Donald Trump. I can't stop Donald Trump from running, but as long as I'm chairman of the party, we're not going to support this. And if you think about it, who knows what would have happened if Priebus had done that? Probably nothing, except Priebus probably would have been booted out as chairman of the party after Trump won the primary. But once the party accepted Trump and allowed that to happen, it was the beginning of the end. And, if you remember, the 16 people ran in 16, including Trump. And all of them, all 15 of the non-Trump candidates, they all believed that all they had to do was get one-on-one with Trump in a primary and they'd win. Because, give me a break. The Republican Party is not going to nominate a guy who talked in public about having sex with his daughter like Donald Trump did. It's impossible. A failed casino owner, a guy who was a maxed out donor to Anthony Weiner. That guy was not going to be the Republican nominee, except he was. And, Romney went out in the spring of 16 and gave that speech. where he laid out what Trump was. And I don't think I'm violating any confidence to say that, I mean, now Mitt is sort of talking about it. He thought others would follow it. He was a former nominee of the party. He had nothing to gain by doing this. And they didn't. And after Trump became the nominee, and I wrote about this in It Was All a Lie, I went to several prominent conservatives, and I told them at the time, you know, I would keep who it was confidential, but you can kind of get, in Florida, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. I tried to get them to run his favorite sons, because all they had to do was take 4 points from Trump and he couldn't win. And if you couldn't win in Florida, South Carolina, or North Carolina, Pennsylvania, you couldn't get elected president. And I had 100% failure. And what they said to me was, look, Stuart, if we, the establishment, and I was part of the establishment then, if we put our thumb on the scales, when Trump loses, we're going to get blamed. It's not going to be because of the racism, the alt-right, this, the Breitbart stuff. It'll be because we rigged the system. What we have to do is just let Trump lose, let all this wash out and start over. And I would say, yeah, I get that, but what if he wins? And they would say he's not going to win. And I probably wasn't very good at arguing the other, because I didn't think he was going to win. But then he did. And, you know, what conclusion I came to after 16 is Donald Trump didn't change the party. He revealed the party. Because you look at this core set of values that Republicans said that we believed in. Might have differed on some issues, but what were they? They were character counts, personal responsibility, deficit matters, strong on Russia. And it's not like the party drifted away from those things the way parties do. The Trump party is against all of those things. Personal responsibility is now you're a sucker. The deficit, my God, I mean, you know what happened under the deficit. We're now the pro-Putin party. The heart of the pro-Putin movement is in the Republican Party. Character doesn't count. I mean, this is what they argue now. You know, you're not electing a minister or a preacher president. And I don't know. I don't think people abandon deeply held beliefs in a few years, unless there's some other piece of evidence. I don't believe in UFOs. If UFO and lands while we're doing this, I'll change my mind. But that didn't happen. So I think all of these things that we posed as a party, as values, I don't know any conclusion to come to, but they were marketing slogans. I mean, I believed it, but I feel like some of others, we feel kind of like a guy working for Bernie Madoff that actually thought we were beating the market. It's like, really? Really? We were just cheating? This wasn't us? And this is what has happened. The Republican Party has become an autocratic movement. And, you know, I wrote this new book because, you know, when there's a lot of incredible work that is done about how democracies become autocracies. Anne Applebaum's book, Twilight of Democracy, is just extraordinary. The book by the two Harvard professors, How Democracies Die. Timothy Snyder's work, Ruth Ben-Ghiat's work. I mean, I go around and passing out these books like watchtowers to random strangers, you know, in airports. And what really struck me was when democracies fall into autocracy, there are always 5 elements that are present. And those 5 elements are present in America today. And we talk about them individually, but we don't talk about them enough together. And how some of them are obviously interconnected. Some of them are interconnected in ways that are not obvious, but they're all present. So what are they? Well, you have to have support of a major party. Well, Republican Party supports Trumpism. You have to have financiers. God knows they have financiers out there wazoo. You have to have propagandists. There's a whole world of that. You have to have shock troops. January 6th, they're out there. And you have to have a legal structure that justifies it. And that's what all these efforts to change how we vote in America are about. And it's one of the difficulties of talking about this is it is difficult to talk about without sounding alarmist. But to me, it's like a pandemic. Whatever you say at the beginning, it'll sound alarmist. At the end, will proven inadequate. And, you know, I say this as somebody, I mean, I worked a long time trying to point out flaws in the Democratic Party, but there's really only one pro-democracy party in America. It's the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party is an autocratic movement now. And if Donald Trump or a Trump wannabe like DeSantis is elected president, I don't think there's any question it'll be the last election we can recognize as an election that we know in America. And once you lose that, it's very hard to get back. So that's why, you know, we formed the Lincoln Project. And, you know, there are people that go through life without regret, and I admire those people. And then there's people like me. And I should have seen this, and I didn't. And I don't know what to do about it now, except try to use the skills that I have. And I was good at this stuff. I was good at electing these people. And those of us in the Lincoln Project were good. To try to not just defeat our old party, but really destroy our old party. Because the Republican Party, as it currently exists, has to be burnt to the ground. There's no saving it. There's no normal to go back to. It's a fantasy. Listen to what Mitt's been saying the last 24 hours. And I can't tell you how it's going to end. I don't think there's any inevitability about this at all. I think Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. I think it's going to be a very close election. The way the Electoral College is, Biden's going to have to win nationally by 4 points or more. And, you know, you hear a lot of talk about how Republicans are better at messaging than Democrats. I really think that's an unfair judgment, because the Republican Party is much more homogeneous. It is a lot easier to put on a concert for people that like the same kind of music. And the great strength of the Democratic Party is its diversity and the fact that it's more like America. But it's much more difficult to have one unifying message. And what drives me crazy about the Democratic Party is this reluctance to rally around Joe Biden. This is going to be between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And when a couple of years ago, Democrats gave an alternative State of the Union address to Biden's State of the Union, I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, why? Why are you doing this? And what Republicans realize is, look, Trump's coalition's 85% white. The country's 59% white, and since we've been talking, it's less so. Americans who are 16 years old and younger, the majority are non-white. And odds are really, really good they're going to be non-white when they turn 18. And this is what Republicans know. And they have a short window here to change the way we vote, to change our system. And if you look at the Supreme Court race verdict of Moore versus North Carolina, which was an independent legislative theory, which I don't know if you followed this, but it's an obscure theory, deservedly obscure, from the Federalist Papers, that state legislatures should have the ability not only to overturn the popular vote in presidential elections, but to overturn any popular vote in a federal election, which is really an extension of how the Electoral College system originally was designed to work. So there was sort of a celebration when this failed 6-3. The other hand, so 3 people in the Supreme Court think that, like, state legislatures can overturn any vote, really? And, you know, if you look at the Federalist Society, and I write about this a lot in my new book, when the Federalist Society started, it was a weekend conference at Yale. Future of the conservative judiciary. Out of that grew the Federalist Society. And it's hard to look around today and say the Federalist Society didn't win. and run by Leonard Leo. A couple of years ago, Leonard Leo was given $1.6 billion, largest single political contribution ever. A guy who owned a very successful but obscure electronics company you'd never heard of in Detroit, gave all the stock of this privately held company to Leonard Leo. The way they did it, they set up a trust. It was literally, the trust was written by a former clerk of Justice Thomas's. The home address for the trust was his home in Salt Lake City, the Marble Trust. They gave $1.6 billion of stock gave all the stock to the Marble Trust. That stock was then sold to an Irish conglomerate for $1.6 billion. So $1.6 billion, largely tax-free, went to this trust, controlled by Leonard Leo. And what Leonard Leo is doing now is focused on changing the electoral system in America. And they're doing it very quietly. This woman, Cleta Mitchell, who was an attorney, who, for reasons I'm very interested in finding out, she was in the room when Donald Trump called Raffensperger and tried to get him to change the vote. At one point, if you read the transcript, she's so frustrated, she takes the phone from Trump and tries to tell Raffensperger, this is really what we're saying. She wasn't indicted, interesting, but she's leading this effort. And, there were 40 some odd pieces of legislation submitted after 1/6 to change voting in America. In some states, it's to make it more inclusive. In more states than not, it's to make it less inclusive. And that's really kind of where I see where you are. And people say, what can we do about it? There's only one thing you can do, and that is you have to crush the Republican Party. And so you take a Republican like Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, right? He's the kind of guy that I would love to have a client at one point in my life. Seems like a nice guy, got a lot of money, smart guy. He's supposed to be the good Republican, right? So what happens? He ends up going out to Arizona and campaigning for Kari Lake. So Kari Lake changed Glenn Youngkin. Glenn Youngkin didn't change Kari Lake. And that's what's happened in the party. And it's very interesting to see what Mitt is saying now, because what Mitt is saying is the absolute truth, and everybody knows it. And the reason that Republicans don't like Mitt is he reminds them you don't have to be a coward. And cowards like company. And, I did all the debate prep for Cheney in 2000, 2004. I worked very closely with his daughter, Liz. When I wrote this book, The Big Enchilada, about the Bush campaign, I predicted then, somewhat jokingly, but not really, that Liz Cheney would run for president. She was that impressive. And that's the Liz Cheney that I knew. And there's no place for Cheney in this party. Wrap your mind around that. So all we can do is fight. I mean, I think the best fights in life you get into, not because you think you can win, but because you have to fight. And that's what we're doing in the Lincoln Project. I never thought at this stage of my life I'd still be doing this, but I don't know what else to do. And we have to win. And groups like this are critically important. So maybe I'll shut up and we'll do questions.
Carly, you're
Oh,
you're
there you
mute.
go. Sorry. That's perhaps a little sobering, but I do have
I'm very depressing.
I do have a follow-on question that fits this pretty perfectly, because our last town hall, we had Donnie Chamberlain from Shasta County talking about what's going on there, and Jenny from Shasta County had a pretty good follow-up question. California is going to vote Democratic, but not Shasta County, certainly, or most of the counties that Sierra Forward is involved with, because we're trying to defeat the Neanderthal majority of the Shasta County Board and their efforts to destroy the election process at great expense to our community. including canceling the Dominion voting machines and implementing a $2 million hand count instead. There's a coalition of Dems and regular Republicans fighting back, but in every community is on its own for fundraising and media strategies to fight the crazies. How do we best fight Trump and still win these local battles?
Well, I think that there is a template for how they're trying to change these local election laws. And I think every victory becomes a model for how to win. So in states like North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, states that are very much in play, Pennsylvania, I think it's important for them to be able to look at success stories and say, okay, this group in California, they did this. What did they do? How did they do this? What can we learn from them? I think it's really important that all of these groups talk to each other and learn from each other, because ultimately there can't really be a national strategy to address what are really local issues. But these local issues are the battleground for how a lot of these states' laws are going to be changed. You know, it's a reality of our system that states run the electoral process, which is, you know, one of the little truth points here. 2020, there are more Secretary of States run elections. There's more Republican Secretary of States than there are Democrats out there. And not one Republican Secretary of State said that there was a problem in their state running elections. So the idea that, you know, there's all these stolen votes, it's like, well, which Secretary of State is saying, yeah, a lot of stolen votes in my state? It didn't happen. So I think each of these little battles is very important.
Carl, you're muted.
I should turn myself back on permanently. Another question was, do you believe the internet and social media in general has contributed to the rise of the Trump wing of the GOP?
Yeah. Yeah. I was on a panel at UCLA night before last that I hope they're going to make public, because there was a woman on the panel who, Frances Hagan, who is sort of the Snowden of Facebook. And she was talking a lot about this. And there really is a turn, you know, you look back at when it was celebrated that the Arab Spring was going to help bring democracy around the world. This was pre-Facebook. And for non-Americans, there's a huge percentage of the world out there that thinks Facebook is the internet. And I write about this in this book, the Conspiracy in America. The Peter Thiel's influence on Zuckerberg to allow Facebook to become part of essence of Russian propaganda and of right-wing propaganda. There was a meeting on a certain date, and Facebook changed its policy. And I think that meeting, you can make a very good case, decided the election. So you look at what's happened to Twitter. I think Elon Musk is evil. I think he's dangerous. I think his recent role in Ukraine is scandalous, probably illegal under the Logan Act. And you look at these studies, Washington Post just published one not long ago about how he has allowed these hate groups to come back on Twitter, how he himself promotes these. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous. It's another conversation, but, you know, I could make a very good case that the accidental billionaires created by PayPal have done to the American social fabric what the accidental billionaires of cocaine did to Colombia. And people forget that Peter Thiel's involvement in PayPal. And when Peter Thiel, who, wrote a book called The Diversity Myth with David Sachs, who's now emerged as one of the pro-Putin evangelists on the internet, where you Google it when we're finished. Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Diversity Myth, Campus Rape, where they wrote how women who had been attacked, raped on campus, why is it that men are always blamed for this? So Peter Thiel, when he took over PayPal, ran PayPal, he really took the editorial board of the Stanford Review, which was this very conservative, somewhat nutty publication, and installed them at PayPal and made them rich. And there's a wonderful biography of Peter Thiel called The Contrarian. The guy had the courage to take on Peter Thiel and write Truth. And later, as more investors like Michael Moritz came into PayPal, they were like, why is the comments editor for the Stanford Review in charge of our business development? And it kind of like, what is happening here? But they all became very wealthy. And imagine, say, the staff of Breitbart became near billionaires. What would the influence of that be? Not insignificant. And that has been a very toxic element that has affected our social fabric. I'm involved in this effort. I hope all of you, when we hang up, you'll go on it, called Resolute Square. A group of us have been involved with the Lincoln Project started it. It is an effort to start a single issue pro-democracy internet platform. And shockingly, there's really not one in America now, except us. And I think that we have to fight these battles. So, one of the hallmarks of autocracies is being able to use the freedoms of a democracy to destroy a democracy. Look at Hungary. This is why conservatives are in love with Viktor Orban now. This is what Viktor Orban has done. And a lot of that is happening. You listen to, Elon Musk when he says, I'm just a free speech absolutionist. Yeah, right. So, I think this is a problem that a lot of our journalist friends have really struggled with. There's generations of journalists that the greatest good they were taught is objectivity. I write a lot. I've published more than most journalists out there. That's what I believed when I wrote. But like a lot of things, it's been exposed as how important good faith was in our system. So how do you tell both sides of a lie? What's the objectivity there? And this is what journalists we all know have struggled with. And they still are struggling with it. So what do? Just Donald Trump, liar every time? And certainly in 2016, this is one of the major contributing factors to Donald Trump defeating Hillary Clinton, when her email scandal was treated with greater severity now than really 1/6 has been treated. And, that contributed to the Comey letter. Donald Trump was losing college-educated voters up until the Comey letter. No Republicans ever lost college-educated voters. So it's a struggle. I know, journalists are well aware of this and are trying to struggle with it, but I think there's been more failure than not. And the recent experiments at CNN or changes at CNN are a perfect example.
So I'm going to give one final question here, and then we're going to wrap up. Obviously in 2016, the FBI and the CIA said that the Russians interfered on behalf of Donald Trump, and of course, Republican Party denied and said that was not true.
Yeah.
What's your perspective? How long the Russians been interfering with the election, and are they still?
I cannot tell you how glad I am this came up, because I think there's one very straightforward story here that we don't talk about enough. 2016, the Russians decided, led by Prigozhin, guy who just, ran the Wagner group, who just fell out of the sky, murdered by Putin. Every intelligence agency in the United States, the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee, they agree that Russians came in to help elect Donald Trump, and Donald Trump won. So what did they get? Well, it turns out they got a lot. So think about it. The most consistent antagonist to the Soviet Union and Russia was a conservative element of the Republican Party. What is now the heart of the pro-Putin movement in American politics? It's conservative Republicans. Nothing like this has ever happened. It is as if a successful German co-op operation took Churchill's party and made it pro-Nazi. And what does it mean? Marjorie Taylor Greene, second most important person in the House of Representatives, she wants to cut off aid to Ukraine, which is the pro-genocide position, the Putin position. The leading three candidates in the Republican nomination, Trump, DeSantis, Ramaswamy, they all have the Putin position. It's a territorial dispute. The United States should either reduce or cut off aid, which is the end of Ukraine. If Donald Trump were president today, can anybody tell us that there wouldn't be a Russian government in Kyiv? No way, of course. That's another thing about Joe Biden. I don't know why the hell we don't talk. Joe Biden has saved the goddamn world by building this coalition. And if you're going to be able to drive in 5 years from Paris to Warsaw, as you can today, if you'll still be able to do it, it's going to be because of Joe Biden and the Ukrainians, his help with the Ukrainians. Donald Trump for president, there would be a darkness there, and there would be tanks in Warsaw in the near future. So if you ask anybody, Les has worked in a lot of presidential campaigns. You ask any Democrat or Republican who ever worked in a presidential campaign, what would have happened if a hostile foreign power contacted that campaign? You would have called the FBI. I mean, it's unimaginable. You would have called the FBI. I mean, every campaign I worked in, and I worked for big Republican campaigns, Dole, Bush, Romney. We always had lots of lawyers. They set you down. They gave you the rules of the road. And that was one of them. And that there are over 100 contacts between Russians and the Trump campaign. I mean, Paul Manafort. I knew Paul. When I was coming up, Paul Manafort and Stone, their consulting group, were a big deal. For reasons that probably showed some deep character flaw on my part. They always really liked me and gave me a lot of work. But everybody knew Paul Manafort was a pirate. He was out there under the Jolly Roger. I mean, I don't know, 2008, 2009, he tried to get us to work for my firm, to work for a Ukrainian oligarch. Said no. He had some oligarch wire transfer us $1 million as a good faith. I went to a lawyer and said, what should we do with it? He goes, give it back. Every cent. We can't keep any. He goes, no. Everybody knew who Manafort was. And to bring Manafort into the presidential campaign, and what did he do? Change the Republican platform. So I don't know what else to say except it is what it is. The Russians have compromised one of the once two leading parties in America. And we should accept that and deal with it and acknowledge it for what it is.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to go drink heavily now after this. But it's very eye-opening, and I really appreciate the insights that you've been giving us here, Stuart. I want to thank everybody that has tuned into this. If you like what you're hearing, be sure that you're on our mailing list to hear about more of it. You can go to sierraforward.com and sign up, and we'll keep you posted on future events. I think we have one scheduled October 26th on the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, which, as the name implies, is about how do we bridge the gulf between rural America and urban America, which there were a few questions along those lines as well. So that would be a good one to tune into. And we have others. We're hoping to do another one in between. So follow us if you can on Facebook, or sign up on our website, and we'll keep you posted on that. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Les, do you have any final comments you want to make?
Just two things. There were some unanswered questions. We may ship those to you, Stuart, and you can answer them and we'll get them out. But again, I want to thank you personally. Sure. It's a joy to be connected with you and working with you on these important issues.
Well, I'm not very joyful, Les, but thanks for the...
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And
thanks, guys.
we'll hope to see you again in the next town hall.
All right.